Chapter 8. Indian Danger. The next night was a ghastly twin of the first. A crazy marathon in the dark, through swamps and briars and branches that clutched like living fingers, until their hearts pounded and their limbs weighed so heavily that they could hardly lift them. For these first miles they relied on speed to deliver them. Though they tried to cover their tracks, they knew they could not hope to foil their pursuers. Besides bloodhounds, the latter would certainly have trained woodsmen with them, perhaps even Indians. Such men could tell from a snapped twig or a bruised blade of grass who had passed and when. Guy and his friends could not deceive them for long, however hard they tried to throw them off the scent. Riach was clever at this. From boyhood he had hunted the deer on his native hills, and took an innocent pride in the fact that he had been an expert cattle thief. Many were the tricks he used to hide their passage, walking up stream beds or over stretches of naked rock wherever he found them. He saw to it that they left as little sign as possible. He seemed to find these places easily, even in the dark. Knowing that the trackers could not follow as quickly as themselves, they made all the distance they could. By the third night they had seen no one, and their spirits rose. Believing themselves secure, they decided to press on in daylight from then onward, so as to cover more territory. There was another reason too. The country was changing, becoming higher and more uneven as they went on, and a deep forest of pine replaced the tangled bushes and cane brakes of the lowlands. The trees grew so thick that they could not see the sky through the thick mat of boughs. At night the stars no longer guided them, and they were afraid of losing their way. Because of this, and because they were unlikely to meet anyone in these lonely woods, they felt safe in moving by day. In the shelter of the pines they no longer feared being caught, and slackened their terrible pace for the first time. For one whole day they rested, for all three were bone-weary and sunk with fatigue. Their poor stock of food was almost done, and they were weak with hunger. All they had left was a few handfuls of cornmeal and some scraps of bacon. They had been eating the bacon raw, as until then they had not dared to risk a fire. They camped in a nook among some rocks, by a clear, fast stream. The pines leaned over and whispered to the bright water, filling the air with the sweet aromatic smell of their branches. Always there was a whisper in the pine tops, Guy noticed. Riach lay on his belly by the water, staring raptly into a pool under the bank. He lay quite still, never moving. Guy watched him without interest, sprawling on the pine needles. Tiny rat's teeth of famine nibbled at his vitals with a sullen persistence, and he could not put them out of his mind, try how he would. All at once the stocky Highlander flipped something out onto the bank with his hand. It threshed madly on the stones in a leaping arch of silver light. Guy sat upright, forgetting his hunger. "A trout! Well done, old Riach!" Riach gave his high chuckle and replied, "Yes, indeed. Many is the time I have tickled them in the burns above Loch Torridon. They will be good eating, whatever." He lay down again, and soon more victims suffered from his wily fingers. Expertly he cleaned and gutted them with his dirk, throwing the offal back into the stream. Now for the first time they lit a fire. Alistair laid it carefully in a hollow in the rocks, so that it could not be seen more than a yard or two away. He used only dry sticks in a tiny pile. Guy helped collect these. "Is it safe?" he asked doubtfully as he watched MacLeod bend over the little heap. Alistair nodded. I think there is no danger here. The dry wood will not smoke much, and the trees will hide it." He took a piece of rotten bark and shaved it with his knife into hair-like fibres. Carefully he made a small nest of these. Then he hit a stone with the back of his knife to make a spark. After a few tries, he got a tiny glow in the tinder he had made, and nursed it carefully with his breath until it grew stronger. Piece by piece he laid pine needles and slivers of wood on top of it, and blew gently. Soon a curl of flame played upward with a faint crackle. Alistair added twigs, and sat back on his heels with his dark smile. "There," he said. "Now we can be cooking Riachi's fish." They spitted the trout on green twigs and set them on broil, after dipping them in what was left of the cornmeal. Guy noticed that his friends were careful to keep the fire small, and to use no wood that was not absolutely dry. In this way the smoke was kept down to a thin haze that wavered upwards into the trees and vanished in the waving branches. When they had eaten, they put out the fire and slept in turns. Alistair, the old campaigner, insisted that they kept a sentry. "We do not think they are close enough to take us," he argued, "but we cannot be sure. And forbye we do not know what other folks are abroad. There may be hunters or Indians in these woods, who would behave ill towards us if we were found." But they were not disturbed. At dawn next morning they ate the last of the fish, and moved on. They headed westward, always climbing. 3 days later they emerged into open hilly country, where the earth was black mould instead of the sandy soil in which the pine trees grew. Alistair and Riach, and Guy himself, felt more at home here. All were used to the hills, though these were covered with a heavy growth of bush, unlike the more barren uplands they had known at home. Spruce, hickory, alders, and tulip trees flourished in wild competition with vines and wild plums. It was hard to make a path through this matted greenery, and they kept to the streams, which offered the easiest passage. Game was all around them. Several times they saw deer, and the sign of foxes, rabbits, and other small animals, which they could not recognise. Once they surprised a bear looting a wild bee's nest for the honey. He was large and black, and not pleased to see them. However, with a woofing grunt, he swung about and disappeared into the bushes, with a speed and silence that contrasted amazingly with his clumsy movements. There were squirrels too, and many birds. The rabbits here were larger than those at home, but all three were happy to see them. For now they knew they would not go hungry. Guy was as deft as the Highlanders at making snares. Unarmed as they were, they could still get food. For a long time they lived on fish and rabbits, and the wild fruit that was beginning to ripen on the bushes. Now they were deep in the wilderness. They had no fear of being caught and dragged back to the settlements by this time. It was unlikely that their hunters would follow so far, and in any event, the latter would certainly give most of their attention to chasing Exon and his gang, in the hopes of recovering the stolen guineas. They discussed the robbers from time to time. "Do you think we will catch up with them?" Guy asked. "It might be ill for us if we did, for they are desperate rogues, and would not welcome our company." Alistair shook his head. "No, Guy. It is in my mind that we have covered a good deal more ground than they. None of them can run the way we did. Besides," he laughed suddenly, "have you ever tried to lift 5,000 guineas? 'Tis a mortal weight to travel with, if you are in a hurry." "Do you think they'll get caught?" "I do not know. It is not unlikely, for there will be no hands at dodging the trailers, and all Carolina will be after them for that amount of gold." They were walking along a narrow game trail, and came out on the banks of a wild river, almost as Alistair spoke. It was fringed with dense woods, which overhung its swift current in an emerald curtain of quivering leaves. Riach was just ahead of them as they moved upstream along the bank. Without warning, he gave a signal with his arm and dived noiselessly into shelter. At once they followed suit. Hidden in the grasses and shrubs, they lay close and peered cautiously through the foliage, keeping deathly still. For a moment, Guy could see nothing unusual. Then, as he scanned the river on the opposite shore, he understood. 100 yards away, something moved on the water, beneath the branches which overhung the far bank. At first he had to strain his eyes to make out what it was. It crept along silently, with never a splash or ripple to show that it was there. Gliding smoothly with the current, it was a canoe. Enchanted, Guy gazed at it, frozen with wonder and not a little fear. It was full of Indians. They seemed to come into view out of nothing as he watched, their coppery bodies suddenly taking shape against the background of sunlit leaves and shadows. All were painted in weird designs, which made them hard to pick out, as the stripes and zigzags of red and yellow blended amazingly with the thickets behind them. These were the first wild savages he had seen. When they came closer, he could distinguish their fierce, high-cheeked faces daubed with bars and circles of crude colour. Their heads were shaved, except for a kind of comb of black hair which stuck up on top of their skulls, decked with feathers and the masks of animals. All the while they were turning their heads this way and that, searching both banks with bright, glittering pupils. Guy shivered as one tall, powerful warrior gazed straight at him, believing that he must be seen. Nothing could escape that cruel wild beast stare he felt, but the Indian made no sign, and the canoe floated on. Relaxing, he let out a tiny sigh, and the cold prickling at the back of his neck died away. Still, hardly daring to breathe, he began to study the canoe itself. It was a long craft, made of sheets of bark sewn together and curved up at either end. In the middle, between the Indians, there lay what looked like a heap of cloth and skins. Guy took this for a pile of bedding, and gave it small attention, until he saw it move. The warrior sitting behind it was trailing his paddle, as only the steersman in the stern held his in the current. When the bundle moved, the Indian hit it with his fist, and it lay still. The icy chills ran up Guy's spine again, with redoubled alarm, and he began to shake all over, for the bundle was a man, tied hand and foot. Guy knew the face, as it reared briefly above the gunwale of the canoe, and he gasped in shock. It was Eben Willits, the White Hunter.